Welcome to this lecture. We're going to focus on Darwin's Voyage of Discovery. I'm sure most of you have heard of Charles Darwin. We're going to look at a little bit of history and his famous voyage on the Beagle. So this is Charles Darwin when he was a younger man. He was born in the early 1800s in a wealthy family. As a child, he was kind of tendency toward a slow learner, and it's mostly because he was bored of the subject matter. He did enjoy chemistry, and he would help his older brother kind of act as the assistant when he did experiments at home. He loved to read, hike, anything with nature he enjoyed doing. He especially liked bird watching, and in just a moment we're going to talk about some of the things he collected on his voyage, and you'll see that he indeed loved birds. I thought this was interesting on what his father had said. Because he did not pursue or want to pursue either being a doctor, which wealthy families did at that time, enter the clergy, or even be a lawyer. So he said, since he was more of a naturalist, you will be a disgrace to yourself and all of your family. So here I was talking about being a doctor. So his father sent him to medical school. Hopefully that would change his mind. But he could not stand the sight of blood. And he found that anything related to medicine, now he liked chemistry and geology and those types of courses, but when it came to the medical studies, he was bored. He did learn from a freed black slave from South America, and he was living in England at that time, and he taught Darwin how to do taxidermy. So that would be the stuffing of animals. And so he was actually paid for this. He would also kind of pick his brain on some of the species that was living in South America at that time. 2 years after medical school, he decided to quit. And his father then thought, well, maybe he should enter the clergy. Darwin considered that because he thought, well, the clergy, they are more of a naturalist, so he might fit into that category. But again, he quit that. Finally, he ended up at Cambridge University, and there were some things that really impacted his life. 4 major events, and we're not going to go in depth into this. I just want to touch on it. He started a hobby of collecting insects. He especially loved beetles. I thought that was appropriate since you had your insect project. Then 2 people kind of shaped his life. First one was Professor Reverend John Henslow, and he was a botany teacher at Cambridge, and he pretty much just kind of took him under his wing, shared information with him, encouraged him to take certain courses, introduced him to very influential people. And one of the persons he introduced him to was Adam Sedgwick, who taught geology, which really, really was important when he went on his voyage at the age of 22. The other thing that was an impact on his life are 2 books, and I did not include the entire title, but one was just looking at the philosophy of nature, and the other one was Travels at the Equator in the regions of America. So those really helped him on his voyage. So let's talk a little bit about the voyage. He developed, through his studies at Cambridge, kind of a scientific theory. This was later, more of his junior, senior year, if you want to think of it that way. He was interested in biological evolution, and he was interested in how do modern organisms at that time evolved from a common ancestor, and really that was the basis of evolution. Now, the voyage itself, the Beagle, and I'll have this on another slide, there were actually 4 voyages that the Beagle took, and most of them did go around South America. But this particular voyage he was on was 5 years, and along that time he collected plants and animals. Some of them he did not know how to identify, so he would send them back for colleagues who were specialized in that, and even professors. So really this is thought of as the most important scientific voyage in history. I had already mentioned that there are 4 voyages, and here I included, this is just a sample drawing of what the ship looked like. So you can see it went around Australia, and then south part of Africa, went up to Asia, and around the tip of South America. And really, he is famous for his stop at the Galapagos Island. So that's where he kind of started to see some relationships. So that particular place is very important. He was invited at the age of 22 to go on this voyage. He was starting to become a very well-renowned naturalist. And remember I mentioned before that the Reverend had introduced him to influential people, and he was talking about him. So that really helped get him on the Beagle. While he was on Beagle, he kept very detailed notebooks of all of his observations, the characteristics, the habitat. So, you know, those observations were very detailed. He really wanted to explain the diversity of biology and species and plants and animals. And what is meant by that is, you know, why are there so many different birds? They have some similar characteristics, but there are varying characteristics. So it's very diverse. 3 patterns that he saw in terms of biological diversity. Some species varied globally. Remember, they travel around the different continents. Some species even varied locally, for example, on the Galapagos Island. And then he saw that species over time, as specimens were collected 25, 50 years after his voyage, they started to change over time as their environment changed. So let's look at a few here. He noticed that if they were ecologically similar and the species inhabited a different place, but the habitat was similar around the globe. So let me go back one. That is where species vary globally. That's where that comes from. One example, all of these birds, they kind of look like ostriches, but they are in fact 3 different species. The first one is we have the rhea, and it's a flightless bird just like the other 2. However, this one lives in South America. The second or middle picture is an ostrich, lives only in Africa. And you have this third one is the emu. You may have seen that at the Kansas City Zoo. It lives in Australia. So if I compare the first and the third, I can see they're really more similar than to the ostrich, but there are a few differences. Color patterns, even the tail is a little bit different. Now, how did they vary locally? Well, he noticed that for especially the Galapagos Island, one particular species that he looked at was the tortoises, the giant tortoises. And they're, depending on what island and what area they lived on, their shell and even their neck had different variations depending on its habitat. So I grabbed a couple of pictures here. So the Isabella Island, which has a lot of, the environment is high peaks, it's rainy, a lot of vegetation, really close to the ground. So this particular tortoise has a dome-shaped shell and a short neck. So he doesn't need to go around and searching for food. Oh, excuse me. The second picture is the Hood Island, and its habitat, flat, dry, not a lot of vegetation. So he has adapted. He has a very long neck, so he can reach out the sparse, higher vegetation. And then his shell is a different shape, not a dome like we would think of a turtle, which looks a little bit like the first image, but it's more curved, it's open, so he can get through and get to that higher vegetation, and he can move a little bit better. The other species that he noticed that there was some variation in was a small brown bird. For the most part, the entire bird, they look very similar to one another, same size, but the one thing he noticed was the beak. And you can see here that the beaks are all different shapes. There's slight coloration difference, but not that noticeable. But the beaks are very noticeable. Darwin also collected fossils, which is how he started to see species varied over time. So he noticed even extinct animals like the glyptodont, this large animal here, 3 meters long, okay, which is equivalent to about 15 feet. Had a lot of similarities of the armadillo, which is about 1/2 meter or about 17, 18 inches long. So those fossils made him start thinking about, well, how are these species varying over time, and how are they passing these traits on to other species? So when he got home, he started looking at his observations, and also he brought back a lot of specimens, especially the birds. He took that skill that he had learned from that free slave on taxidermy. But you can see here that just depending, that brown bird was the finch, depending if they ate seeds, cactus, insects, or fruit, their beak changed or was varied to be adaptation to whatever food that they were eating. So that's one thing that he noticed, just kind of pulling all the pieces together. So he began to wonder whether the Galapagos Islands, the species of that island, might have evolved from other ancestors, and that they were really not fixed, that through some natural process, which at this time he really didn't have a term for that, we now know as evolution, but he saw that there could have been some kind of change that occurred naturally so these species could survive, kind of the survival of the fittest. So that kind of wraps up this particular video. If you have any questions, just ask me in class. Thank you.